Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first online lecture for the year for both HoWo and WHAP, and it's going to deal with the rise and spread of Islam. In this lecture, we're going to deal with the origins of Islam, where it came from, some of the cultural components of it, and how the empire that came about was run, and also how it spread to get to the empire status that it eventually did. So the first thing we're going to look at, which is the same thing we do for every culture, civilization, religion, etc. that we look at in this class, is some of the geographic conditions that are present in the landmass where it started. As you can see from the map, you're looking at pre-Islamic Arabia, or the modern-day country of Saudi Arabia. Now, the question at the bottom is pretty self-explanatory with why was farming so difficult, and it was so difficult because a lot of Saudi Arabia is made up of desert. Alright, it's impossible to be able to grow crops. So for that reason, it had a very profound impact on life and the way that people went about their business in this place. For our purposes, as we're talking about Saudi Arabia and the origins of Islam, over here on the western side is where the cities of Mecca and Medina are, and that's where we'll focus here in just a second. So the way that the geographic factors of Arabia influenced life in pre-Islamic Arabia, and even to a certain extent affect life today, is the fact that most people had to be nomads. Alright, they weren't settled agriculturalists. They went from place to place, either trading or herding their animals or whatever it was. The link between these different groups of people, or tribes as we're going to call them from here on out, is caravan trading. Now, if you remember from the lecture in class, we talked about how caravan trading, when you see caravan, the first thing that should come to your mind should be camels. And we talked about some of the advantages of having camels as a form of transport in the desert and all that. But for the purposes of this, you just need to know that the link between these different tribes and what brought them together was the fact everyone was involved in this form of caravan trading that they had. So we move the conversation from the focus on the nomads to the city of Mecca, which is where Islam originates. And the first thing we've got to figure out is, why was Mecca an important city? As you can see from the map, it's not located on any of the major trade routes that we've talked about this year, like the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean Trade Network or anything like that. What Mecca had going for it at this time is it had access to these trade routes. Okay, it wasn't necessarily located on them, but there were corridors that led from the city to them, which gave them relatively easy access, considering the time and the place that we're talking about. So for that, it became kind of a center for several things, a crossroads of trade, if you will, and it was also known for other things that we'll look at in the next slide. Another thing that Mecca had going for it at this time was not only was it connected to the major trade routes of this period, it was also home to the Kaaba, which was a shrine that contained idols, and it was a money-making machine. Alright, pilgrims came from all over the immediate area and basically the region during this time period to come and hang out and see this thing. And when they did, they spent money on souvenirs, places to stay, all the things that drive a tourist economy. So as this happens, a lot of people in Mecca begin to make a lot of money and become very powerful, which is going to play on down the line when we start talking about Islam and some of the conflicts and some of the problems that Muhammad has as he tries to start spreading the message of Islam and things like that. So that's kind of the conditions and the way things were running in Saudi Arabia before Islam comes along. Now we're going to we've set the stage for it. We're kind of going to move forward to how Islam actually gets founded and how the message begins to be spread by Muhammad and things like that. So before we get into the belief systems and all the things that comprise the religion of Islam, let's take a second and look at the life of Muhammad, the guy who actually founded this religion. Muhammad was born in Mecca about 570 CE into the Quraysh tribe, which was one of the most powerful trading families in Arabia at this time. He was orphaned by his parents at a relatively young age and ended up having to live with family members on the way to him getting to adulthood. He lived with his grandfather for a while and he lived with his uncle for a while. As Muhammad gets older, he eventually breaks away from his family tribe, at least when it comes to a business standpoint, and goes to work for another trading company which was run by a woman named Khadijah, who had recently been widowed. Kind of indicative of the way that Arabia worked at this time, that she was able to run the business after her husband died. Well, nonetheless, Muhammad becomes an agent for her, which means he is in charge of transporting goods from one place to another and the transactions and all this place. Well, after a while, they end up getting married, Khadijah being 40 years old, Muhammad being 25. And it's pretty significant with this relationship because she becomes one of his most ardent, one of his most supportive people as he tries to start to get the message of Islam out and things like that. So now we move kind of to the main event and how Islam gets started. Muhammad would go to meditate in a cave from time to time, and one night when he was up there, he was visited by the angel Gabriel. It's something known as the Night of Power and Excellence. When Gabriel visits him, he explains to Muhammad that he has been kind of tapped to spread the message of God. In other words, he's going to be the next prophet, and it's going to be his responsibility to spread the word of God and to bring people into the fold and have people become a part of this new religion that he's more or less going to be promoting. When the angel Gabriel comes down and talks to Muhammad, he gives him three main revelations. Now, there's a couple more as we go forward, but these are the main ones. Number one, tells Muhammad that one God created all. Number two, he says that there will be a judgment at the end of time. In other words, you'll be judged on how you live your life here on earth. And number three, to get into the afterlife, you must submit to God, or Allah, as God is known in the Islamic faith. So here's how this goes down. Muhammad starts preaching his message in Mecca, and as he does, it begins to gain popularity because there's a lot of components of what he was saying that appealed to a lot of people in Mecca. So he's getting kind of a decent following there in Mecca. Well, as he does, he starts to come into conflict with the major tribes of Mecca, because as you recall from one of the earlier slides, they made a lot of their money from selling idols to people who had come and visited the Kaaba. Well, one of the main teachings of Islam, as well as Christianity for that matter, is that thou shalt not worship false idols. So, as Muhammad's preaching this, it's starting to cut into the money of the Meccan merchants because people are not buying these idols, and they're also persuading people who come into Mecca not to. So, in response to that, the merchants of Mecca began to put pressure on Muhammad by persecuting his weakest Muslims and also threatening him to the point where he feels his only option is to leave. And that's what he does in 622. He flees to Medina in a journey called the Hijra. When he does this, he goes back, kind of regroups, and then comes back later and defeats the leaders of Mecca and takes over the place as the center of Islam. But at this point, it's kind of a touch-and-go situation with whether this movement will get going or not. So the next couple of slides are going to deal with what happens when Muhammad passes away, and it deals with the succession, or who's going to end up running Islam or being the leader of the religion after he passes on, and how they're going to pass that power on down the line. So here's the deal. Muhammad dies before he can get around to naming a successor or trying to figure out how they're going to decide who's going to take over for him once he's gone. At the end result of this, it ends up being a huge rift between two sections of Islam, which we'll talk about in a second. But for the time being, after some conflict and after some arguing, a guy named Abu Bakr is chosen to succeed him. Now, he was Muhammad's uncle. He was on his inner circle. He knew the ins and outs of the religion, and as well as how Muhammad might want to proceed with expanding it and continue to refine it and things like that. When Bakr comes in, he takes the title of Caliph, which means successor, and is used on down the line through the early stages of Islam. And like it says here, it leads to a split, which we'll deal with now. So the two different camps that come out of this argument over who should succeed Muhammad are known as Shiites and Sunnis. And the basic difference is just in the succession. There's some other arguments and some other conflicts between them, but this is the main one, or the one that everything stems from. Shiites believe that whoever is in charge of Islam, or whoever is the head of this religion, should be a descendant of Muhammad. In other words, they felt they should keep the family line intact. All right? And they also believe that the Caliph should take more of a secular road than a religious. I think I used in class, he should be more of a president than a pope. In other words, he should be more concerned with the running of Islamic lands that they had taken over, or the empire, whatever word you want to use, rather than being the head of religious doctrine and the head of things like that. The Sunni sect of Islam, on the other hand, believed that whoever ran this religion should be selected by the community from a pool of qualified applicants. In other words, the best person for the job should get it. So the conflict comes from family dynasty or best in the community, and everything kind of spreads from there. Now we're going to move on from the founding and the origins of it to talk a little bit about the belief systems of Islam and how it works as a religion and how it impacts some of the people in their day-to-day lives. Islam basically runs around what are called the 5 pillars of Islam, which is their 5 main responsibilities, or the 5 main things you're supposed to do if you're a part of this religion. Now, I told you in class you don't have to know the Arabic terms for these 5 pillars, but you need to know the components of it and what they are. So first we've got, and I'm breaking it down for you fairly easy here, the first one is, you must profess there is no God but Allah. Okay, you can only believe in one God. 2 is the ritual prayer, which you must do 5 times daily, and you also must do pointing towards Mecca, no matter where you're at in the world. 3 is charity, is giving alms to the poor or the needy or the infirmed or whatever it is. 4 is Ramadan, is fasting. We talked about that in class, about how you can't eat or drink anything from daylight to dusk. Okay, so while the sun's up, you can't eat or drink. And 5 is the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. You must attempt or do this one time in your lifetime and go worship at the mosque in Mecca. On top of the 5 pillars, there's also several behavior guidelines, and I've highlighted some of the most important ones right here that play a role as we go forward in history, and even to a certain extent have an impact on how relationships between Muslims and other people in the world go today. First and foremost is no pork. All right, you're not allowed to consume any kind of pork products because swine is considered to be an unclean animal. Number 2 is no alcohol at all, no spirits or anything, and that's going to lead something we talk about later in the year with the rise of coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire a little bit later on from where we're at. Also, you must wash before praying. You must be clean before you pray. And lastly is jihad, or the struggle for the faith. Today it's known more as holy war, but back during this time that we're talking about, it was more just spreading the message, trying to get Islam some kind of place in the world and a foothold in the religious aspects of the world at that time. So moving on to just a couple more characteristics of Islam that you probably already are aware of. It's a monotheistic religion. There's only one God, known as Allah. Allah is the God of, we're going to strike this out right here because I've got a typo. It should not be Judaism. It should be Islam. Okay, so the same God is present in both religions, and Jews and Christians are known, and you'll see them referred to in documents or maybe on the test as people of the book. Moving on to some of the components of Islamic civilization back during this time, as long as you've got a basic understanding of the origins of it, where it comes from, and some of the major beliefs of the religion, you should be okay as far as that point. So we're going to take a second look at kind of how that impacted people's daily lives and all this kind of stuff. So as far as how it influenced people's daily lives, I mean, we're in a time period, and I spoke about it in class, we're in a time period where religion is kind of the overriding force of everyone's life, because life is very chaotic at this time. They need some kind of stability. They need some kind of direction. And the religions, both Islam and Christianity, provided this in the places where they were dominant. So Islam, much like Christianity during the Middle Ages in Europe, affected a big part or all of your daily life. And it extends to your family life, which is your relations between husbands and wife, or fathers and children, parents and children, however you want to word it. Also the economy. Islam, as it expanded, it influenced and impacted trade in the regions they went into, and also back home at the origins in Arabia. And it also impacted slavery. All right, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. As far as the family setup during this time period in the Middle East, it's not a lot different in some ways in places that we've talked about. There's also a couple components that are different from where we talked about. Number one, the man was the head of the house, which is a continuity that we've seen throughout this course. He makes the rules. He's king of the household and all these kind of things, and his word cannot be questioned. Something that makes Islamic civilization a little bit different than the places we've talked about is that men could have as many wives as they could handle. Now, they had to support all of them on equal basis, or as equal as they could get it, but if they had the means, they could expand their household by adding wives over time. Women had a little bit more rights in this area at first. Now, this is going to change over time. But at first, they had a little bit more, independence or economic independence than other places in the world, and the fact that they could inherit, much like Khadijah did her husband's trading business. You could inherit things from your husband, and you could also seek a divorce. Now, it's not a guarantee that it'll be granted, but at least they have that opportunity, whereas in other parts of the world at this time, it was not even an option. One of the main components of Islam that we're going to talk about as we go forward is their intellectual advancements that they made. I mean, we're going to talk about a time period called the Golden Age of Islam, in which they make several strides in the areas of arts, architecture, medicine, and other forms of learning or education, or however you want to word it. And it kind of all centers from this place called the House of Wisdom, which was located in Baghdad, which is in modern-day Iraq. Baghdad was one of the most important cities of this time period as far as trade, as far as learning, as far as culture, as far as whatever criteria you want to put on it. And what they did at this House of Wisdom is they took text from the Greek scholars and they moved them over to their own needs. Like, they studied them, they furthered them, they improved on the process that they talked about. And we're talking about science and medicine and things like this. So they took the theories that were proposed by these ancient Greek scholars and made further advancements with the technology and the things that were known during this time. And it's one of the most important legacies of Islamic civilization during the time period that we're talking about. Out of the House of Wisdom, as well as just out of the complete intellectual curiosity that led to the Islamic Golden Age, were several innovations that are still in use today. First of all is their calendar. I couldn't find a picture of it. I apologize for it. but it was used to track their religious festivals, which is a little bit different than the reasons we've talked about using calendars up to this point. As you recall, in a lot of the earlier civilizations we looked at, people used calendars simply to track the agricultural cycle. In other words, when to plant their crops, when to harvest them, when to figure out when it was going to flood, and things like that. They took it away from that and moved it more as a marker to denote when they were supposed to celebrate different aspects of the religion. Another invention or innovation that becomes huge as we go down the line, and we're going to talk about this thing again after Christmas when we get to exploration and Columbus and all those kind of guys, is the astrolabe. Now, the astrolabe is a navigational tool that you use on ships that basically helps you determine latitude, okay? As not going to go into the ins and outs of it, but it helps you find positions of stars and planets to help you determine where you are north or south on the planet, where your position is. And what this allows you to do is to sail into open water. In other words, you don't have to keep the shore close as you go from place to place. So it allows for open water sailing, which becomes hugely important on down the line when people begin to start coming to the New World or trying to find a new route to India, which inevitably ends up with the discovery of North America and South America. Next is mathematics, which I know is all of your favorite subjects, so you can kind of blame them for this if you want to. The numbers that we have, the basis of our system, 0 through 9, are Arabic numerals because they were invented and refined by Muslim scholars during this time period. Once this happened, this then led to further innovations like the development of algebra and trigonometry, and once again, your favorite subjects that you have throughout the day. Another thing that we're going to look at, another innovation, I guess, or another contributing factor to this golden age is Islamic art. Now, Islamic art is a little bit different than other styles that we'll look at, be it like Renaissance painting or even religious painting with Christianity. It's a little bit different in the fact that it rarely has human or animal figures in it. And the reason for that is simply because it is forbidden in Islam to depict Muhammad in a picture. So you can't paint him. You can't come up with anything visual. You can't show him in any kind of work. Now, because they're not allowed to put human or animal figures in it for the most part, particularly with Muhammad, they had to come up with some other kind of way to express themselves. And the way that they came about it was using geometric patterns or floral designs, as you'll see in the next two paintings come up in the slides. So the next two slides are examples of Islamic art, and as you look at them, I want you to pay attention to a couple of things and at least be familiar with the art style, because you might see this again on down the road. Pay attention to kind of how the patterns work together, how the artists went together to try to express some kind of message or whatever it is, without using humans, animals, or anything like that. Next on our list of innovations is calligraphy, which is just basically their style of writing. All right, the components of it and the advantages of it are no different than any other thing that we've looked at this year, be it cuneiform, be it the Phoenician, be it hieroglyphics, whatever. All the advantages and all the reasons that they came up with it are the same, particularly for them because of the extent and the largeness of their empire. They needed something to tie everything together to make communication and transactions a lot easier. So they came up more or less with their own style of writing to make sure it was consistent throughout the empire that they had. As far as their architecture styles go, you normally see the best examples of Islamic architecture in their mosques or in their version of churches. The one that you see here is the Taj Mahal, which was one built in India that we'll get to later on in the year. But a couple of things to notice on this. Number one, is just the way that it's built and the fact that it has a dome on it. And you'll see this in a lot of mosques that we look at in the next couple of days. Also, you need to pay attention to these towers on the sides of the mosque. These are called minarets, and it's where back in the day, before the advent of telephone speakers or anything like that, when Muslims were to be called to prayer, someone would climb up to the top and shout or ring a bell or whatever it was to give them the signal that it was time to pray. So it was simply a combination of both functionality and the fact that they needed some way to let their voices carry, and it also blended itself into some kind of style that's kind of predominant and kind of exclusive to mosques in the Islamic world. Here's another example of a mosque that we'll look at later on in the year when we talk about the Ottoman Empire. This is the Blue Mosque, which is located in Turkey, which was the seat of the Ottoman Empire. But once again, kind of the most, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, architectural wonder, whatever you want to call it, but a perfect example of the ideal of of Islamic architecture and how in perfection it was supposed to look. Alright, so we're going to wrap this up with Muslim conquest. This is going to be very short, very brief with a couple of maps. This part of it will be handled in class, so you should have notes or whatever you need to be able to study for the test with that. So we'll go through this pretty quickly, and then you'll be through with the first online lecture of the year. So initially, when Muhammad gets going, or shortly after his death, Islam spreads mainly in Arabia. And the reason that happens is because they have to first conquer the neighboring tribes or bring them into the fold before they can begin an outright period of conquest or spreading very, very rapidly. So as you can see from this, this is the first portion. The Arabian continent, or the Arabian Peninsula, is the first place in which they begin to conquer, and then it moves on from there. One of the reasons they were able to take over such a large area of land in such a short period of time is because of the technology and the fighting skills of their army. Now, we'll talk about these in class, but as you look at this picture, try to remember some of the things we talked about that gave them an advantage over the people that they were fighting and allowed them to keep pushing forward to where they become one of the largest empires or land empires in history to that point. Alright, so here's where we end up. You can see by 750 CE, Islam has arose from a rather humble religion confined to Arabia to one of the largest religious empires in history up to this time. I mean, they've expanded and taken over northern Africa for the most part. They've worked their way up almost into Western Europe. They did conquer Spain, which we'll talk about in class, but they were stopped in the Pyrenees Mountains on the other side at the Battle of Tours, which kept them from properly going into Europe and possibly running them at some point. They've basically taken over the eastern side of the former Persian Empire. They're working their way into the Byzantine Empire. They're conflicting with them, and that's going to culminate in 1453, that we'll get to after Christmas. And they become one of the most powerful entities on Earth, and it's more or less become a force to reckon with for everyone else in the Eastern Hemisphere. And that's kind of where we'll go in class. Alright guys, I appreciate you listening to the first online lecture. Hopefully more to come. Hopefully they'll get better, or at least I'm going to try. But take note of this. You'll need it for study purposes. And until next time, we'll see you.